years. So Barbara is a sociologist of education with a background in history, social anthropology and women's studies. She is currently a reader in gender and social inequalities at the School of Education in Glasgow, and previously she was senior lecturer at Roehampton University and research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Education at London Metropolitan University. She does hold a PhD in sociology, a MA in women's studies, and a BA in history and social anthropology. Barbara is also currently a PI for, and I should say congratulations, Barbara, a little belated, for an ESRC-funded project entitled Gendered Journeys, the Trajectories of STEM Students through Higher Education and into Employment in India and Rwanda. And this is a very large-scale project which is funded until 2023. Barbara has also extensively written on issues of equity, as I'm sure you'll be aware of, at all levels of the education system, although a significant part of her work focuses on higher education. This extensive body of work includes 2 books, one with Becky Francis and Chris Kelton on the identities and practices of high achieving pupils, published with Continuum in 2012, and another book which I really, really like, Barbara. It's a fabulous book if you haven't read it, with Carol Lefoot, called Gender and the Changing Face of Higher Education. Excuse me, A Feminized Future, which was published with the SRHE and Open University Press. So thank you, Barbara, for being a keynote speaker today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Marie-Pierre. That's really lovely. And it's so nice to see you again and to meet people that I haven't met yet. I'll just share my screen. Do I have the ability to do that?
Yes, I hope so. I'll give you access if it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay, so it won't be a moment. Okay, is that sort of showing up for everybody?
Lovely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so first of all, just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me both to talk today and also to be on the editorial board. The journal looks to be a really special thing, and I'm really happy to be part of it. It's really great. So for today, I've been asked to speak about work that I've done or am doing in relation to equity and social justice in higher education that might resonate with the journal and the themes of the first issue, and what we're trying to do with the journal. And I was thrilled, therefore, to see that the special issue theme is writing the field of equity. Because this was really my intro into higher education research. As Marie-Pierre mentioned, I did a sociology PhD that wasn't really connected to education, but my first job as a contract researcher was looking at potential gendered patterns in student writing. That was with Becky Francis and Christine Skelton. I was very lucky to land that as my first job. And I was immediately really influenced and struck by the academic literacies approach. Leon Street had written an article in 1998, and not that much before I started. And it really helped me sort of work out how, what I wanted to do in terms of theorizing higher education. For those of you not familiar with it, Leon Street's approach is to go beyond 2 areas or aspects of looking at student and academic writing. The first is the sort of more individualist deficit study skills approach, which Penny Jane and Marie-Pierre have already written in the editorial about, something that they're keen for us to be critiquing in the journal. But Leon Street also talk about looking a bit further than what they call the academic socialization approach, whereby we acknowledge that there are sort of particular cultures and practices in the academy, but the emphasis in this academic socialization approach, they say, is that the emphasis is trying to get the students to fit into the academy. And it's a case of just trying to socialize them and then everything will be okay. And they were advocating sort of more radically that we needed to critique the cultures and practices of higher education themselves, and look at the ways in which they have been reflecting and reinforcing dominant structures of power. And that really, I think, laid the focus for me in all the sort of work that I've done since, really. And so what I was going to talk about here was two aspects of research that I'm doing currently in higher education, and thinking about how they merge to start off with, and also how they hopefully resonate with the journal and the goals of the journal. So one of them is, as Marie-Pierre mentioned, I'm leading a project called Gendered Journeys, which is looking at the experiences of STEM students at university, and what happens to them afterwards, whether or not they go into skilled employment. And that's particularly in India and Rwanda, although we're doing some sort of comparative work in the UK. As I'm sure all of you know, that the sort of gendering of the disciplines is a global issue. And the other thing that I've been looking at is precarity particularly in the academic workforce, and the sort of the difficulties and the exacerbation of inequalities that are sort of entwined in terms of precarity in higher education. So those are the two things I was going to talk about briefly today. I'll try and be brief. Okay, so before I do that, I wanted to just mention how I've been theorizing precarity, and that particularly I'm drawing really on Judith Butler and her work on precarity, where she distinguishes between the sort of precarity that is just the product of accident. So you might be slipping on an icy pavement, for example, and in comparison to social precarity that is connected to, or indeed induced by, wider socio-political policies and practices. For example, being moved on to a 0 hours contract, for example. So she calls it as the politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks, and then they become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. And so the key thing for that we've been taking up is this differential exposure, so that people who are already disadvantaged in certain ways are likely to feel the effects of precarity more strongly, and be more likely to be affected by it. And that's something that that we've taken up and looked at in terms of higher education staff, which I think really links to the special issue concern of whose knowledges are getting valued here, who has the ability to generate the sorts of knowledge that we talk about in the academy and that students learn in the academy, and what is more valued and what is less valued, and who gets to author this. We know that as I've mentioned, pre-existing patterns of social inequality in the academy are intensified by the dynamics of precarity. For example, and forgive me, I'm sure there's people who have expertise in this as well. I'm aware I'm talking to a very knowledgeable audience here, but forgive me if I'm going over basics. But just to take a UK analysis by the Equality Challenge Unit in 2015, they found that the people most likely to be on temporary or teaching only contracts in higher education are women, under 35s, disabled and Black minority ethnic academics. So we can see already that, we know that there's underrepresentation of certain groups in higher education anyway, and that they are more likely when they are here in the academy to be on these insecure, low-paid contracts. And within precarity, there's also differences. So, for example, O'Keefe and Courtois talk about how that the length of time spent performing precarious academic labor is also gendered, as women are more likely to have worked in the sector longer than their male counterparts. So then, because of that length of time in there as on precarious contracts, then sort of exacerbates the inequality of experience that they get. And we did a study, Carol Leithwood and I, in 2018 about looking particularly about staff on precarious contracts. And one of the things that they talked about were the difficulties of being able to secure a stable future in academia. And there was a link, a very sort of clear link really, with Bellant's discussion of cruel optimism within late capitalism, where an object of desire, or perhaps more easily seen as a sort of cluster of promises about what can be given to you, that on one hand you might have this objective desire that holds up prosperity or flourishing for those who can attain it, but at the same time the same processes are simultaneously impeding or blocking your ability to get what is being offered. And in higher education, we can see that the sort of promise of a secure future in HE is kind of offered up to people, but at the same time, it's impeded by the demands of producing quantifiable outputs with little or no support to fulfill the requirements. And again, this is something that Penny and Marie-Pierre touched on in the special issue editorial. And so in terms of sort of authoring knowledges, for a lot of contract researchers, it seems that the difficulty is being able to develop a specialism and put in grants for future funding as a PI or a co-I when you've only been contracted to work on an existing project with no ability to show to funders that you've got a secure connection to an institution. And being stuck in the present in this way has a plethora of knock-on effects. And I'll just give you one quote from our study. And this is Faye, who says, in part, the dilemma is balancing priorities. As a contract researcher, once one project finishes, and often before, you've moved on to another project, and the headspace to write from the former project is less easy to find. She says, I do feel a confident and experienced researcher, but my ability to see myself as a specialist in one specific area is much harder. And so you can see obviously there's a connection there between who's got the headspace and the sort of funds and resources to be able to write in the academy and to be read and to be and for what they write to be valued. And there's a connection also with the Gendered Journeys project. One of the things that we're looking for, taking STEM subjects as a particular focus, is, as I mentioned, what happens to students once they go into employment. And that includes whether they go on to do postgraduate study and go on to be academics in STEM subjects. So one of the things I just wanted to briefly talk about here is how does precarity mesh with issues around gender and STEM in India and Rwanda, and that can be extrapolated to many other contexts as well. So there have, of course, been long debates about the differing dynamics of precarity in the global North and global South, where writers such as Scully, I put the name up there, noting that working conditions that are seen as quite new in the North actually have a lot longer duration in the South. But that being said, a number of writers in the global South have linked the rise in the influence of neoliberalism in higher education in their countries, particularly since the 1990s, with an exponential growth of casualization in the academic workforce. For example, Chatterjee there and Jagannathan and Pakarissame, in the case of India, have talked about how precarity has increased hugely in Indian higher education, compounded by a reduction of state funding for faculty salaries. And they particularly look at the intersectional impact of caste and gendered dynamics in India. So obviously this is something that needs an intersectional approach, as well as a sort of country-specific approach. Now, so if I want to look at gender and STEM dynamics and inequalities in that, how does precarity work within that? And I think it is complicated by the differing values that are placed on different knowledges, which of course, again, I'm sure a lot of you are researching on and have expertise on. But of course, as we know, within universities and society more broadly, there are strong associations between the hard sciences and the concept of masculinity, and the social sciences, and especially the arts and humanities, with the concept of femininity, but with the so-called hard sciences being more highly valued. And Steinthors-Dottir and colleagues in 2018 argued that this dynamic can lead to STEM disciplines in universities being more favored by university decision makers in relation to funding and resource decisions. So they did a study of STEM departments and social science and humanities departments at the University of Iceland, and they found that, to quote, STEM departments are able to provide more advantageous positions and better working conditions for their early career academics, who are mostly men, than the more feminized, that's their term, social sciences and humanities school. And we've seen that many national governments also place investing in STEM disciplines as a priority. We've seen in the UK, for example, that Johnson's government pledged a huge investment in the sciences before COVID made them walk this back. So the benefits of this valuing of the sciences, of course, benefits women and non-binary STEM academics as well as men, although there are, of course, complex patterns of inequality within STEM disciplines as well. So as well as being in a numerical minority overall, women are particularly underrepresented in some areas of STEM, for example, computing and artificial intelligence and engineering. And as we've already talked about, women and BME academics are disproportionately working on precarious contracts within and beyond STEM. And so they're less able to capitalize on this sort of disciplinary advantage. Even if they are, if they're STEM scientists, they're less able to capitalize on any advantages, such as the increased possibilities of institutional support and external funding. So these are things that we need to be taking into account. And I'll just finish up here on the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is something, of course, that we all need to be sort of factoring in as well as an issue. And reporting does seem to indicate that pre-existing inequalities are being compounded since the onset of the pandemic. I just wanted to show you an article from the Times Higher Educational Supplement of May the 15th this year. And it was authored by a group of 35 women scientists working on COVID-19 research. And they stated that even in the article, even lifelong battles for a place in science have left us unprepared for the gendered and racial inequalities we have experienced in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they cite as examples that women and Black minority ethnic scientists are chosen far less often to speak to media and be brought in as experts in relation to the pandemic. And of course, as we know more broadly, childcare and other caring responsibilities have fallen disproportionately on women over the various lockdowns in different countries. We have seen what's been called the productivity divide, where journal editors were reporting far fewer articles being submitted to journals from women since the start of the pandemic. And STEM disciplines, again, have not been the hardest hit in terms of academic job losses since the pandemic. We've seen that job losses in the arts and humanities seem to be particularly prevalent. So there's, again, gendered and racial dynamics in that. As we know, many universities have actually concentrated their job cuts post-COVID on casualized staff. So again, we can see how people who are already disadvantaged then feel the effects of more instability and precarity even more strongly. So just to conclude, as I've mentioned, the Gendered Journeys Project seeks as one of its goals to de-individualize the narratives around gender and STEM, particularly the conception that disparities are down to personal choices, such as lack of interest by women in STEM subjects, or what is mainly needed is personal encouragement or assertiveness training to get women entering and succeeding in STEM disciplines. And again, you can see this is the sort of resonance with what Marie-Pierre and Penny highlighted as the prevalence of the sort of deficit discourses involved in talking about groups of students that come from less privileged backgrounds. And we're keen to focus in this project, like the journal, I think, to focus on the social dynamics and processes that influence the journeys of students through higher education and into employment, and how gendered, institutional, and wider social cultures and practices influence someone's chance of graduating and moving on into STEM careers and perhaps generating academic knowledge themselves. So, as I've hoped to emphasize here, one of the wider institutional cultures and practices that we really urgently need to address in higher education is the short-termist culture of casualization in the sector. So we do need to look at, obviously, diversity amongst the disciplines, but also we need to address the inequalities engendered by short-term contract culture, how they affect staff, how they affect students, and how they affect the forms of knowledge that get privileged in the academy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.